The Grand Academic Conference was a prestigious gathering, bringing together some of the brightest young minds in the United States, as well as seasoned scholars, researchers, and intellectuals from various scientific disciplines. The event was known for its intense intellectual debates, where ideas clashed and the most innovative perspectives emerged. It was a place where academic rigor was held in the highest regard, and discussions were often competitive, challenging, and unapologetically direct. Among the attendees was Barron Trump, a name that immediately drew attention. While some assumed his presence was merely due to his father's influence, those who had followed his academic journey knew otherwise. Barron had earned his place among these scholars not because of his last name, but because of his intelligence, dedication, and remarkable academic achievements. However, whispers circulated in the halls. Some skeptics believed he was only there as a symbolic gesture rather than a true participant in scholarly discourse. Despite the murmurs, Barron remained composed, focused on what truly mattered. Engaging with new ideas, learning from the greatest minds in the field, and contributing meaningfully to discussions. He was not there to prove a point about his family, he was there to test and expand his own intellectual capabilities. His calm demeanor and reserved nature set him apart from the usual high-energy debates that filled the conference rooms. Among the distinguished speakers was Professor Sebastian Foster, a well-known academic figure with decades of experience in philosophy and cognitive psychology. However, beyond his academic credentials, Foster was infamous for his open disdain toward religious beliefs, particularly Christianity. He took pride in dismantling faith-based arguments with cold, calculated reasoning, often turning his lectures into performances where religious perspectives were not just challenged but outright ridiculed. Foster saw himself as a champion of modern rationality, believing that faith and reason were fundamentally incompatible. This particular conference session, titled Leaving Behind Outdated Beliefs and Embracing Modern Rationality, was expected to be no different. As attendees filled the hall, the air buzzed with anticipation. Many had come to witness Foster's sharp wit and uncompromising stance against what he deemed intellectual crutches. What they did not expect, however, was that the discussion would take an unexpected turn, one that would not only challenge Foster's long-held assertions, but also reshape the conversation surrounding faith and intellect for years to come. Professor Sebastian Foster was a towering figure in the world of academia, renowned not only for his expertise in philosophy and cognitive psychology, but also for his aggressive stance against religious beliefs. He had built a reputation over decades as an unrelenting critic of faith, particularly Christianity, which he saw as an outdated and intellectually inferior framework. Foster was not just a scholar, he was a performer. His lectures were designed to entertain as much as they were to educate, and he took pleasure in dismantling theological arguments with sharp wit and an air of intellectual superiority. His students either admired him for his unapologetic approach or feared him for his ruthless method of engaging with opposing viewpoints. For years, Foster had thrived on the debate stage, where he would provoke, challenge, and systematically take apart arguments that dared to introduce the possibility of a higher power. He wielded statistics, historical references, and cognitive science research as weapons, presenting faith as little more than a psychological crutch for those unwilling to confront the stark reality of a godless universe. His disdain for religion was not subtle. It was central to his identity as an academic. Many in the scientific and intellectual community saw him as a bold truth seeker, while others viewed him as a man blinded by his own biases, unable to acknowledge the limits of human understanding. At this high-profile academic conference, Foster was prepared to do what he did best, assert his belief in pure rationality and mock those who clung to faith. His presentation, provocatively titled Leaving Behind Outdated Beliefs and Embracing Modern Rationality, set the tone for what was expected to be a combative session. He had meticulously prepared his arguments, gathering a collection of charts and studies that, in his view, would demonstrate the decline of religious belief in correlation with rising education levels. For Foster, the message was clear: intelligence and faith were incompatible. However, what made this conference different was the presence of Barron Trump. Foster had heard of the young man's reputation, whispers of his intelligence and disciplined academic background had reached him. But to Foster, Barron was still a product of a family deeply tied to conservative values, and therefore, likely indoctrinated by religious dogma. Spotting Barron in the audience, Foster saw an opportunity. With his signature smirk and biting sarcasm, he made a calculated decision. He would use Barron as an example, exposing what he assumed would be the intellectual fragility of someone raised in a household of traditional beliefs. What Foster didn't anticipate, however, was that this particular challenge would not unfold as easily as his previous ones. Instead of an easy intellectual victory, he was about to encounter an opponent unlike any he had faced before, one who would challenge not only his arguments but the very foundation of his arrogant certainty. Professor Sebastian Foster stood at the center of the grand lecture hall, his presence commanding attention. He was in his element, pacing back and forth with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent decades dismantling opposing viewpoints with ease. His topic for the day, leaving behind outdated beliefs and embracing modern rationality, was one he had delivered countless times before, always with the same results, mocking laughter from his supporters and uncomfortable silence from those who dared to disagree. Today, however, the stakes felt higher, for among the audience sat Barron Trump, a young man whose name alone carried weight in political and social circles. Foster spotted Barron early on, seated near the back of the hall, his expression unreadable. He saw an opportunity. Raising an eyebrow, the professor decided to direct his next attack toward him. "Let's address the elephant in the room," Foster declared, his voice laced with condescension. Studies consistently show an inverse correlation between intelligence and religious belief. In simpler terms, the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in fairy tales. A smattering of laughter rippled through the audience, though not everyone joined in. Some students glanced uneasily at Barron, waiting to see his reaction. If Foster had expected the young man to shift uncomfortably or avoid eye contact, he was mistaken. Barron remained still, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze locked on the professor with quiet intensity. Encouraged by what he assumed was silent intimidation, Foster pressed on, displaying a graph on the large screen behind him. "As we can see here," he continued, pointing to a declining line, "the more education a person receives, the less likely they are to cling to religious dogma. Fascinating, isn't it?" He turned back to the audience, his smirk widening. "Of course, I imagine some families find it difficult to break free from deeply ingrained traditions." His eyes flickered toward Barron, the implication clear. The tension in the room thickened. A few students exchanged nervous glances. Professor William, another academic present in the room, shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable with how personal the attack had become. Foster, however, was undeterred. He had built his reputation on pushing boundaries, and today would be no exception. "Tell me," Foster continued, leaning forward slightly, "what does it say about a person's cognitive development when they still believe in an invisible sky deity in the 21st century?" The room fell into an almost suffocating silence. It was clear that Foster had crossed a line, but he reveled in the discomfort. He expected Barron to falter, to stammer, or to remain silent altogether. But instead, something unexpected happened. Barron slowly stood up. He did not appear flustered, nor did he seem angry. Instead, his expression remained composed, his posture relaxed yet authoritative. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear, measured and calm. "Actually, Professor," Barron began, his tone polite but firm, "I would be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." A murmur spread through the audience. This was not the reaction anyone had anticipated, least of all Foster. He had expected nervousness, perhaps even frustration, but not this, an invitation to engage on equal intellectual footing. Foster's smirk faltered ever so slightly. The game had just changed. Barron Trump stood tall, his posture exuding quiet confidence as he addressed the room. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of anticipation and disbelief as students, academics, and even Professor Foster himself waited to see how this young man would respond. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the smug arrogance Foster had displayed just moments before. "Actually, Professor," Barron began, his voice steady and composed, "I find it interesting that someone who claims to champion rational discourse would resort to mockery rather than academic discussion." A few murmurs echoed through the hall. Some students who had initially smirked at Foster's remarks now exchanged glances, recognizing that this wasn't going to be the easy humiliation their professor had anticipated. Foster's confident expression wavered slightly, but he quickly recovered, crossing his arms as he leaned back against the podium. "Oh please," Foster scoffed, shaking his head. "Spare us the sermon. I've spent 30 years studying cognitive development. Are you suggesting you know better?" "I'm suggesting," Barron continued, unfazed, "that your bias is showing, Professor. You claim to follow the evidence, yet you conveniently ignore the countless brilliant minds throughout history who have reconciled faith and reason, Newton, Planck, Collins, to name a few." Foster let out a dry chuckle. "Ah, here we go, more appeals to the past. Tell me, Mr. Trump, is your God an advocate of Make America Great Again too? Is that what you're going to tell us next?" Laughter rippled through a small section of the audience, but the majority remained silent, waiting for Barron's response. He did not flinch, did not react with anger or frustration. Instead, he took a deep breath and spoke with clarity. "You know what's fascinating, Professor?" Barron said, tilting his head slightly. "You mock faith while displaying your own kind of religious devotion, a blind faith in your own intellectual superiority. You've created your own form of dogma where anyone who disagrees with you must be cognitively inferior. The silence that followed was deafening. Foster's confident smirk began to fade, and for the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Professor William, who had been observing the exchange closely, leaned forward in his seat. He had never seen Foster challenged so directly, let alone by a student. It was clear that Barron wasn't just standing up for himself, he was systematically dismantling the very foundation of Foster's argument. So tell me, Professor, Barron continued, his voice measured and unwavering, what's more intellectually honest, admitting that there may be things beyond our current understanding, or arrogantly claiming that we have already figured everything out? Foster opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence in the room was suffocating, and everyone knew that this debate was far from over. The debate had taken an unexpected turn. What had begun as a calculated attempt by Professor Foster to publicly humiliate Barron Trump had now become something entirely different. The once confident professor, known for his intellectual bravado and relentless mockery of faith, was now struggling to maintain his composure. Meanwhile, Barron, still poised and composed, had subtly shifted the entire dynamic of the discussion. The audience, once filled with quiet chuckles at Foster's sarcastic remarks, now leaned in, captivated. Even those who had initially dismissed Barron as nothing more than the son of a former president were beginning to recognize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. He wasn't just defending himself. He was exposing the hypocrisy and contradictions in Foster's arguments. Foster, now visibly uncomfortable, attempted to regain control. He straightened his posture and adjusted his glasses before responding. "All right, Mr. Trump," he said, forcing a smirk. "Since you seem so eager to challenge established academia, let's take this discussion further. Tell me, do you honestly believe that faith can withstand the scrutiny of science? That religious thought, which has historically opposed progress, can coexist with reason?" Barron did not hesitate. "Yes, I do," he replied, his voice steady. "And so do many of the greatest minds in history. But the real question is this. Why do you insist on presenting faith and science as mutually exclusive when they have, time and time again, informed and complemented one another?" Foster chuckled, though the confidence in his laughter had diminished. "Ah, so you're one of those people, the ones who think science hasn't already debunked religion." Barron shook his head. "That assumption in itself is flawed. Science explains how things happen, but it does not address the why. You claim that religious belief is a sign of cognitive weakness, yet some of the most brilliant scientists and philosophers, Newton, Einstein, Francis Collins, have all acknowledged the possibility of something greater. Are they all intellectually inferior by your standards?" Foster hesitated. He had not expected this level of articulation, let alone such a well-reasoned argument from a student. He could feel the weight of the room shifting against him. "You're cherry-picking," he snapped. "Correlation isn't causation. Just because some scientists were religious doesn't mean belief in God has any scientific validity." "Exactly my point," Barron countered smoothly. "And yet, you were quick to use correlation when it suited your argument about IQ and religious belief. You presented a graph to suggest intelligence and faith are inversely related, implying causation without definitive proof. If correlation isn't causation, why does it apply when you need it but not when it challenges your stance?" A murmur spread through the audience. Even those who had initially sided with Foster now saw the flaw in his reasoning. Foster's face reddened. He opened his mouth, but for the first time in his career, he had no immediate retort. His carefully constructed narrative was unraveling before his eyes, and Barron Trump had just turned his entire argument against him. As the debate continued, something unexpected began to happen. Professor Sebastian Foster's once unshakable confidence started to wane. The smug expression that had been a constant throughout his lectures was now replaced with something far less assured. His usual strategy of using mockery and sarcasm to overpower his opponents wasn't working, and he knew it. Worse yet, the audience had noticed too. For years, Foster had enjoyed the role of the intellectual giant, dismantling religious arguments with cutting wit and a sharp tongue. He had reduced faith to a relic of the past, something that only those who were intellectually inferior clung to. But tonight, standing in front of a young man who met his every point with composure and logic, he was forced to confront a reality he had long avoided. His arguments were not as bulletproof as he had once believed. Barron Trump, who had at first been the target of Foster's ridicule, now stood as his equal, or perhaps even his superior in this discussion. The room that had once echoed with Foster's authority was now hanging on Barron's every word. The shift in power was undeniable. Realizing he was losing ground, Foster attempted to steer the conversation back into his comfort zone. Mr. Trump, he said, forcing an air of condescension into his voice. Perhaps you're simply misunderstanding the purpose of my argument. I'm not attacking individuals. I'm simply making the case that religion, historically, has been a barrier to scientific progress. Barron tilted his head slightly, considering Foster's words. Then, with his characteristic calmness, he responded, Professor, let's assume for a moment that you're right. Let's assume that at times, religious institutions have slowed scientific progress. But does that mean that faith itself is the problem? Or does it mean that institutions, like any human-run system, are fallible? Science and faith are not enemies, and to suggest otherwise is to ignore history. For every Galileo who was silenced, there was a Newton whose faith inspired his scientific discoveries. For every scientific breakthrough opposed by dogma, there was a devout scientist pushing the boundaries of human understanding. Foster opened his mouth to argue but hesitated. He had never been challenged quite like this before. Normally, those who defended religion either became emotional or crumbled under his intellectual pressure. Barron had done neither. Instead, he had calmly, methodically deconstructed Foster's stance, and in doing so, had exposed the professor's own biases. A silence settled over the room. Foster glanced at the faces in the audience, many of whom were no longer looking at him as the intellectual authority in the room. He could feel it now. The respect he had taken for granted for so long was slipping away. For the first time in his career, Sebastian Foster felt something foreign to him. Doubt. And it was written all over his face. As the debate between Barron Trump and Professor Sebastian Foster reached its climax, the atmosphere in the lecture hall had completely shifted. What had begun as an attempt to publicly humiliate Barron had transformed into an intellectual reckoning, one that had left Foster exposed and uncertain. His usual sharp wit and commanding presence had faded, replaced by visible discomfort. For the first time in decades, he found himself struggling to maintain control over the room. Barron, on the other hand, remained poised. He had never raised his voice, never resorted to mockery, and yet, with each carefully measured response, he had dismantled Foster's long-standing narrative about faith and intelligence. The young man had done what few before him had managed. He had forced the professor to confront his own intellectual arrogance. Foster exhaled, gripping the podium as he tried to regain composure. Well, he muttered, clearing his throat, I suppose I must concede that you've presented some compelling arguments. The words were hesitant, unfamiliar to him. He had spent years in the academic world, where he had been revered as an authority on reason and rationality. Yet now, standing before a student half his age, he realized that he had underestimated the depth of his own bias. The audience remained silent, watching the professor's internal battle play out in real time. He looked down at his notes, but for the first time, they felt hollow, merely rehearsed statements he had repeated for years without question. Had he truly been engaging in open discourse, or had he simply been using his platform to impose his own views under the guise of intellectual superiority? Barron, sensing the shift, chose his final words carefully. Professor Foster, he said, his voice still carrying the same respect it had from the beginning. True intellectual pursuit isn't about shutting down ideas we don't agree with. It's about exploring them with an open mind. Science and faith have coexisted for centuries, not because one must conquer the other, but because they both seek the same thing, truth. Foster's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of realization settling upon him. He had spent so much time trying to disprove faith that he had neglected to see its value, not just as a belief system, but as a fundamental part of human inquiry. He wasn't ready to abandon his skepticism, but for the first time, he saw it for what it was. Just another form of belief, another assumption about the world. With a slow nod, Foster met Barron's gaze. There was no longer hostility in his eyes, only contemplation. Perhaps, he admitted, there's more to consider than I once thought. As the lecture concluded and students filed out, whispers of admiration filled the air, not for Foster, but for the young man who had stood his ground with grace and intelligence. And as the professor lingered at the podium, deep in thought, he realized that tonight had been more than just a debate. It had been a lesson, one he had not expected, but perhaps one he had needed all along. The impact of the debate between Barron Trump and Professor Sebastian Foster did not end within the walls of the lecture hall. What had started as an intellectual confrontation soon evolved into a nationwide discussion, capturing the attention of students, academics, and the media alike. Within hours, clips of the debate surfaced online, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. The footage of Barron calmly dismantling Foster's arguments, while maintaining composure and respect, became the focal point of discussions in academic circles, political debates, and even religious communities. What made the event so compelling was not just Barron's ability to hold his own against a seasoned intellectual, but the way he did it, with dignity, logic, and an unshaken belief that faith and reason could coexist. Many who had previously dismissed religious perspectives as anti-intellectual found themselves reconsidering their stance. Articles and opinion pieces flooded major news outlets, with some praising Barron's eloquence and others questioning whether the academic world had become too dismissive of differing viewpoints. Professors from various universities weighed in, some defending Foster, arguing that he had merely been challenging outdated beliefs, while others admitted that he had overstepped professional boundaries. Beyond academia, the conversation extended into cultural and political arenas. Conservative media hailed Barron as a symbol of intellectual resilience, framing the debate as a victory against what they saw as the increasing intolerance of traditional values in higher education. On the other hand, progressive commentators attempted to downplay the moment, with some claiming Foster had been unfairly targeted or that the debate had been exaggerated for political gain. However, the raw footage spoke for itself. Barron had not engaged in hostility, nor had he disrespected Foster. He had simply challenged an argument that had long been accepted as absolute in academic spaces. Among students, the response was particularly striking. Many young people, including those who did not necessarily share Barron's faith, admired his courage to stand up for his beliefs in a setting where he had every reason to back down. Some student organizations even began hosting their own debates, inspired by the exchange, discussing the role of faith in intellectual discourse. For the first time in years, there was a renewed interest in examining whether science and faith had to be opposing forces or if they could, as Barron had argued, work in harmony. Meanwhile, Professor Foster found himself at the center of scrutiny. While some of his longtime supporters defended him, others acknowledged that he had been caught off guard by a student who had not only matched him in intellect but had also exposed a deeper issue, the tendency of academia to dismiss faith without real discussion. Foster, now aware of how widely the debate had resonated, found himself reflecting on whether his approach had been as intellectually honest as he had once believed. Regardless of the differing opinions, one thing was certain. This event had sparked a conversation far beyond a single lecture hall. It had reignited a centuries-old debate and reminded the world that true intellectual pursuit requires humility, openness, and the willingness to challenge even our most firmly held beliefs. The long-term effects of the debate between Barron Trump and Professor Sebastian Foster extended far beyond a single academic event. What had initially seemed like an isolated confrontation gradually became a turning point in how faith and intellectualism were perceived in modern academic discourse. The conversation that Barron had sparked did not fade but instead gained momentum, influencing students, professors, and even the broader cultural landscape. In universities across the country, the debate led to renewed discussions about the role of faith in intellectual pursuits. Many students who had previously been hesitant to express their beliefs in academic settings now felt emboldened to do so. Campus organizations that had focused solely on secular perspectives began inviting speakers from diverse backgrounds to discuss the intersection of science, philosophy, and religion. For the first time in years, the rigid divide between faith and academia began to soften, with more scholars recognizing that both perspectives could contribute to meaningful intellectual growth. For Professor Foster, the event marked a significant turning point in his career and personal philosophy. While he did not publicly renounce his atheistic views, those who followed his work closely noticed a subtle but undeniable change in his approach. He no longer mocked religious beliefs in his lectures, and instead of using faith as a target for ridicule, he began engaging in more balanced discussions about its role in history, philosophy, and human resilience. Some speculated that his private reflections had forced him to reconsider not just his tactics, but also the deeper assumptions that had driven his rigid stance for so many years. Meanwhile, Barron Trump continued his studies, unaffected by the political and media frenzy that surrounded the debate. He did not seek to capitalize on his newfound fame or turn the moment into a political weapon. Instead, he remained focused on his academic pursuits, continuing to demonstrate intellectual curiosity and a commitment to meaningful discourse. His ability to engage in high-level debates while maintaining composure and respect left a lasting impression, not just on those who had witnessed the event firsthand, but on anyone who watched the viral footage of the debate. The broader cultural impact was even more profound. Mainstream media outlets, which had largely ignored or downplayed faith-based perspectives in academic settings, were forced to acknowledge the legitimacy of the conversation. Some newspapers and talk shows began discussing whether the modern academic world had grown too hostile toward religious perspectives, while others highlighted how Barron's debate had set a new standard for how difficult conversations should be conducted, with respect, intellectual rigor, and an openness to diverse perspectives. Most importantly, the event served as a reminder that intellectual strength is not about silencing opposing viewpoints but about engaging with them honestly. It proved that genuine debate requires humility and the courage to question assumptions, no matter how widely accepted they may be. In this way, The legacy of Barron Trump's debate with Professor Foster endured, not as a mere viral moment, but as a symbol of the ongoing struggle for true academic freedom and open-minded discourse. The debate between Barron Trump and Professor Foster carries valuable lessons that extend beyond the walls of academia. At its core, the event highlights the importance of intellectual humility, respect for differing viewpoints, and the enduring power of faith in an increasingly skeptical world. One of the key takeaways is that true wisdom does not come from silencing others but from engaging in meaningful discussions. In a time where debates often turn into personal attacks, Barron demonstrated the power of responding with grace and reason rather than anger. This lesson is particularly relevant for older generations who have witnessed how public discourse has changed over the years. It serves as a reminder that standing firm in one's beliefs does not require hostility but rather a deep understanding of one's values and the ability to express them with clarity and respect. Another crucial message is that faith and intellect are not mutually exclusive. Many older individuals have seen a cultural shift where faith is often dismissed as outdated or irrelevant. However, this event reaffirmed that faith continues to provide meaning, resilience, and wisdom, qualities that should be embraced rather than ridiculed. For those who have lived through changing social and ideological tides, this serves as encouragement to continue sharing their beliefs and experiences with younger generations, ensuring that valuable traditions and lessons are not lost. Ultimately, this story is a testament to the enduring importance of respect, patience, and open-minded discussion. It reminds us that in any debate, whether about faith, politics, or personal beliefs, maintaining composure and seeking truth is far more powerful than resorting to hostility. As we navigate a complex world, the ability to listen, learn, and respond with dignity remains one of the greatest strengths we can possess.